If you've been listening to me for a while, you've probably heard me talk about this idea of character being central to your story. And I might go even so far as to say that the main character is the most important aspect of your story because it drives how your story is told, why it's told that way, and how that person interacts with the world. If this is true, then finding the right character for your story is extremely important. And how to find that correct character is what we are going to talk about today. Welcome to How to Write Good. I am your host, Daniel Poppy. You can find out more about me at danielpoppy.com. If it is your first time here, How to Write Good is a writing podcast that seeks to find principles and advice that can be applied across a broad range of writing situations. If you've been here before, don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button below, and share. Your main character determines everything in your story. And I realize that may be a brazen statement to some, but I don't say it without reason. When you write a story, you must write it through some person's eyes. And whatever eyes you are looking through as you write that story will determine how the story is told. This is most clearly seen when an author writes in first person. When the author writes effectively, the author has put on the persona of that character and written as if they are that character. In a certain way, writing then becomes like acting, except instead of being on stage, portraying a character through their bodily movements, mannerisms, etc., they are portraying a character through how that character would write about a specific thing. But even books that do not decide to write through first person must follow this rule. And they must follow this rule because even if they are writing from an omnipotent perspective, they still are telling a story about a specific character or characters. Those characters, who they are, and how they change are what is interesting to the reader, and they cannot go beyond what they know or who they are. So, this goes back to my first point, that whichever character you choose to have as the main one will determine what story is being told. We as writers must write characters as they are. We must develop them logically. We cannot change those characters without reason. We only can change them based on logical, reasonable things that happen within the story. This is what I like to call earning the character change. You may be wondering, how does this have anything to do with choosing the right character for my story? But understanding this fundamental nature of characters within story is important to take the next step to find the right one. But how do we do this? The process is actually fairly simple, but it does take time. What we do is we take different characters and place them in the story or world that you've created. Once you do this, you should notice there are a few incongruencies about your story. Maybe your original character was poor, but the new one is rich. So your original character lived in a rundown apartment, but your new one can't live in a rundown apartment. Or if he or she chooses to live in a rundown apartment, then that person needs to have a reason for doing so. In the same way, the rich and the poor do not have the same acquaintances. A rich person might know a senator. A poor person is unlikely to know a senator. If we even go down to the basic thought processes behind each of these people, each one of them is going to think differently. A person who is poor is more likely to think of the here and now and less likely to think of the future because they need to survive in the here and now. And a person who is rich is probably thinking decades down the line. Just this single way in which they think could change how they approach a risky situation. Just adding this difference in class changes so many different things. A rich person is going to have more resources. A poor person is unlikely to be able to pay a person to do something. You can see a big contrast between Batman and Spider-Man because of this wealth gap, or if we want to call it class gap. Each of their stories is told in a dramatically different way. Now, as I said before, this process takes time. I am just focusing on one single aspect of a character, but there are millions of different aspects that you could change. For example, have you ever thought about your character's eyesight? Have you ever thought about whether they have a specific disease? Have you ever thought about them being overweight or having malnutrition or having bad teeth? That could play into who the character is and what happens in the world. They're really simple things, but really simple things can have profound impacts on stories in the same way they've had profound impacts on history. This is why in another episode I talked about how history is an extremely important area to look into when finding ideas. In some cases, changing a character can completely make the story collapse. For example, if Helen of Troy was not beautiful, there would be no reason for the Trojan War. Sticking to just Greek storytelling, if Achilles had never been dipped in the river Styx and become invulnerable, he would not have had much of an issue with pride, and the whole reason for his story being told would have been eliminated. I'm not mentioning this idea of certain stories falling apart when you change specific aspects of the character because I think you should avoid those specific aspects. I think when a story falls apart, it's a ripe field for different ideas. Why did the story fall apart? What can we do to fix that? What can we do to change that story to turn it into something that actually works? What would happen if this central aspect of the character was changed? How would this character play out in the world? This all goes back to my basic idea that you take the character and play that character out in the world to his or her logical end. Why does this help you find which character you should put in your story? When you come up with a certain story idea, you generally have a story you want to tell. The story might not look exactly like a story. You might not have a full plot line, but you generally have a vague emotional sense of what this story is, how it'll move, and how it'll end, and how that end will impact the reader. By going through this process of exploring different characters within that story idea, you may find stories you don't want to tell. But unless you do the work of exploring the different possibilities, you won't know if you're actually telling the story in the best possible way. For example, if you want to tell a specific type of love story and you pick the first character that comes to your mind, it may be the case that that character is correct, but it also might be the case that you're missing out on the character you need to tell that story in the way you want to tell it. Now, I know some of you are going to hear this advice and you're going to go off running and you know exactly how you're going to apply it. But some of you are sitting or driving or whatever you're doing and you're thinking, how do I actually find characters to put into my story to test if they're going to work or how they're going to change the story? If you want to know more, I'm not going to tell you right here, but I've put out another episode that talks about that very idea. So it's going to be either linked up here or in the description. So check that out as well. If you enjoyed this, you're probably wondering how you can support me. Well, you can actually do two simple things. Follow the first link below to grab a copy of my book, and then follow the second link and sign up for my newsletter. It's that simple. Those two things will mean the world to me and give me more time to write books and create content for you. As always, my name is Daniel Poppy, and this is How to Write Good.